Hello and welcome to the Data Empathy Podcast. My name is Patrick, and I'm very happy to have Amit here with us today as our inaugural guest to talk about data empathy.
Hey, Patrick. Thank you so much for having me on. I didn't realize I was the first guest, so that puts a little bit of pressure on me to say something that resounds through the rest of the series.
Yeah, thank you very much for being here. To many listeners, it might sound like a bit of an oxymoron to put data and empathy together in one phrase. But when you hear that, what does that mean to you?
Well, when the phrase was first put to me by Darren, I did sort of wonder, and then it felt very natural to me. I'm an analyst by training and by trade, and so I deal with data all the time. I hadn't actually thought about it in this way, but if just a little bit of thinking about it, you realize that it's really all about understanding the data and how better to understand than to put yourself in the place of that data or think about, if you will, the story of the data, how the data were created, nurtured, massaged perhaps, and then presented. So there's a lot of thinking and feeling that goes on. And especially, I would say, in the area of people analytics, which is my field, within HR. And so the role of HR is one, if you think about it, of almost nurturing the employee and the employee experience. And people analytics within HR has this extra accountability then to make sure that the data are true, representative, that we are thinking about the data the right way from a standpoint of making sure that it's secure because it's private information, that there's concern and respect for the privacy around the data, and individuals' rights around the data, and then the ethical use of the data as well. So lots and lots of aspects of data empathy to talk about for sure.
Definitely there's a very strong focus on keeping things private and, of course, respecting people's right to keep their data private and the legal restrictions involved, and those are different in different countries. So that's all critical. But for thinking about this kind of HR perspective, do you have some concrete kind of stories to tell or use cases where you felt like it's particularly important to be empathetic with the individual person that it concerns, or with the data set as a whole?
You know, you raise actually a very important point, the empathy with respect to the individual and maybe the results of the analysis you've done based on some data work. And so that has to be presented back. And even if you think about, for example, a performance review, you're getting pieces of data about a person from different sources, perhaps, and you're having a discussion about that with the employees. So in that sense, very specifically from an HR standpoint, there's a requirement to be empathetic around how you treat that information, how you discuss it, and the way you even present it, because I think feedback can often go badly, especially when it comes from a position of power. And so if it's more empathetic in the feeling of trying to put yourself in that person's shoes, then I think it's going to be a much more positive and productive conversation. But that's the thinking empathetically about the person whose data it is. But I think in HR now, in people analytics, there is increasing use of reliance on artificial intelligence. And HR is sort of a latecomer to the big data revolution. It had been small data and medium data for a long time. But now we have all of the processes and systems sort of fine-tuned to actually provide the data that we can use. And I think the aspect of empathy that comes up here is the notion of fragility. So we're using all of this data on people and what they do, what they think, what they feel, and we're relying on that to make all sorts of decisions about people and individuals and teams and organizations. But that flow can stop at any point if we don't treat the data properly and don't talk about it with the people who are providing it. So there almost has to be a compact between providers and the users of the data. And at any point, if I think the providers who are employees, and in many cases they don't have a choice or maybe rights in this regard, but I think increasingly with legislation and with this increasing focus on people analytics for the benefit of people, I think it's becoming more important or more recognized that individuals, employees have rights on their data and they have a choice then. And it's very clear in the case of, say, an engagement survey, an employee survey, where the organization is asking for input and hoping that it's authentic, that it's truly felt, so that the company can actually make changes and improve things. But if at any point the employees feel that nothing's going to be done with that data, or the question is not asked the right way, or they don't really trust what the organization is going to do with it, they'll stop responding, or they'll respond artfully, right? So I think it's fragile, and so you have to be thoughtful about it. And in that fragility, or that the notion that employees can begin to gain how they respond, what they write in emails, who they send emails to, if actually the organization is plumbing that data and that metadata for example, trying to understand informal networks or whether people are feeling included or not. That data can become tainted if people are beginning to gain how they're responding.
Yeah. So especially from an artificial intelligence point of view, which is my field, it's always crucially important to make sure that the data set is clean, so to say, that it actually represents the situation, that multiple data points are comparable to each other, so they have been created using the same sort of standards. So you mentioned multiple points where employees might respond differently or not respond depending on how things are asked. But you also mentioned that artificial intelligence is being used in these HR processes now, and sort of most of us, of course, are employees, and so I think we would be interested, or the audience would be interested to hear, how is AI being used on our employee data, and what might be the outcome or the risks if that is not treated properly.
Yeah, and we could have a separate podcast on just this, but AI is used to match, define patterns, to cluster, and so there are many use cases within HR where you'd want to do that. So if you think of starting from recruiting, how do you match applicants to jobs? And so you can have somebody read the resumes and read the job descriptions and do the matching. That's the old-fashioned way. Now your resume is being parsed for keywords and other information. And there's a matching algorithm that identifies, even if you apply for one job, maybe there's another job that you're better suited towards. So you can have matching. I think another area of AI that's being used more and more is natural language processing. So we always had the quantitative side of the house covered. And I think HR probably lean more towards quantitative analysis because HR is considered somewhat squishy to begin with. And so let's lean on the hard stuff. But there's a treasure trove of unstructured data, if you will. Resume is one example, but performance reviews and job descriptions and all sorts of free-form text entry and surveys. And so you can begin to look at those data and try and find patterns, whether it's you're looking for patterns of bias, perhaps, in what people are writing about other people. Pretty much any pattern that you think needs to be detected and dealt with. So yeah, just a couple of simple use cases. It's not as if it's rampant or even that it's not being done carefully. I think it is. I think everyone realizes how sensitive this whole aspect is. And the last thing any company wants is front page news that, the employees had no idea that this was going on. So I think very often companies come up with ethics charters so that they can explain what they're doing, why they're doing it, and also how it benefits the employee at the end of the day.
So I guess a take-home lesson for all of us who might submit our resume somewhere is to use the right keywords in that resume so that the algorithm, as opposed to the human HR person that reads that resume, will pick it up. So that initial hurdle of getting the screening interview by a human is I guess the thing to watch out for. It's good to learn.
Yeah, and there's AI comes with bias, right? So you then have to make sure the algorithms are appropriately tuned. So often we'll take out the names, so you can't impute anything from the name and various other things that might lead to bias in some way in the decision.
Yeah, and of course, from an AI perspective, bias in natural language processing has been an issue these last 10 years or even 2 years. It's tricky because, of course, these systems are trained on corpuses of natural language output that has inherent some opinions. Mm-hmm. So I guess there too, there's an empathetic component, right, from the HR department. To what extent is it right, ethically, morally, realistically, to use many automated systems to treat human individuals?
Yeah. And within HR or within any data generating or collecting system, data are not created sort of objectively, right? There's all kinds of bias in the creation of data as well, because there may be preferences or incentives around the creation of that data, or how it's collected, or how it's transformed before decisions are made. And so that's why I think you have to understand the full story of the data, where it came from, and why it was collected, how it was collected, what may have been done to it in its life cycle before it gets to you, so that you can be completely aware of any further biases you might introduce, right? And it's now we're awash with all kinds of metrics and analyses, and sometimes we don't think about why those were constructed or how those were constructed, and we don't think about how the data were collected. But it's very important to trace that back and see what the story is.
So from the HR point of view, where do you see more need to kind of watch out for this bias? Is it on the part of the individual who supplies a data point into the system? Or is it from the point of view of the HR in person who then analyzes a large number of these data points? Where is the right place to kind of focus on lowering the bias?
Yeah, I think the analyst certainly carries a lot of weight here because it's their job, if you will, to analyze the data and come up with some insight or solution. And throughout history, we've observed that the messenger often gets shot because
always yes.
Right. So it becomes incumbent on the analyst to make sure that they've done their homework and have, traced the data back and understood that journey, and wherever possible, have strengthened the data generating infrastructure so that going forward it remains unbiased. But I think it's also the accountability of anyone consuming insights to question. Right? But too often people are also somewhat biased unconsciously to just take what they were hoping for without questioning. And so we need people to think differently about data and analytics as well. And here I think it's, because it's somewhat new in HR, I think we have to do a better job of helping people be skeptical. So trained as an economist, I'm very skeptical by nature. But most people are trusting. Luckily, most people are not economists. And so they may take something, especially from an expert, without too many questions. So certainly the expert has an obligation, a duty, if you will. But any consumer of data also should be skeptical to begin with.
Yeah, I think that's a very valuable lesson for all of us. Even as we read newspapers and we're presented with statistics, we need to question how that was obtained. As you might know, the most popular statistics textbooks is entitled "How to Lie with Statistics." Excellent book, and it drives home the lesson that if you present the same data in different ways, you can communicate a very different interpretation of that data.
If I can just interject one example there that comes to mind. Income inequality is a big deal in this country and others, and the general thinking is that income inequality has worsened over time. I think a few weeks ago there was an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal by Phil Graham, who's an economist by training, and somebody else I can't remember. But they went back and looked at the income distribution data, and they did some alternative calculations to show that if you accounted for example, transfer payments paid to folks in the lower end of the distribution, and you accounted for the taxes paid by people on the higher end of the distribution, they claim that income inequality actually has come down. Now, I'd question that. We probably need to go back into the data and look more carefully. But that's a very, important point, whether income inequality is increased or decreased. And I applaud them for looking into it, and probably need some more work to make sure, what the full story is, because they may have, a certain bias coming into it themselves, as do I or anybody else who might hope for or imagine certain trends in the data.
Yeah, indeed. And so within an organization, of course, these HR analyses are being made and not necessarily published in the New York Times. So I guess the level of scrutiny and skepticism might be significantly lower, but might in fact be more pertinent because decisions are going to be made for individual employees. Where have you seen that analysis of HR data led to some real decisions that impacted individual employees?
Yeah, and Patrick, before I go on, I should say that, I hope I'm not giving the impression that people in HR are sort of in the Wild West going crazy and doing all kinds of stuff with data and people and making crazy decisions. There's a lot of thought and care and accountability and responsibility. In HR in general, people are very careful about this, and people analytics, the profession, is especially careful because, as I said, it's pretty fragile. If there's no data, there's no job for people analytics,
right,
folks. But like you said, in AI, there's all kinds of biases, and there are published accounts in the newspapers of companies using AI for recruiting. And as you said, it's based on a corpus of historical data where Perhaps in some roles there weren't that many females, and so the algorithm using the historical data will lead you to hire males at a higher proportion than if you hadn't used the algorithm. Now, how different that is from if a human were doing it, we don't know, but at least we know that there's a bias in the algorithm. So those kinds of cases are what then cause everyone to pay attention and be extra careful.
Yeah, definitely.
But the other AI and other tools in analytics in HR are also explicitly used to detect bias and remove it, so that we're dealing with fact and with unbiased information to make decisions that are also therefore unbiased in any way.
Is there a piece of advice as an advisor and coach that you would give for HR personnel on how to deal with this situation? What would be your main advice to these?
Well, if there is a people analytics team, I would advise everyone to make friends with them and understand what they're doing. Get help yourself from them so they can help you with your challenges and questions you have that would help you in your job. But in general, just become a little bit more data savvy. I don't think many people in HR in sort of joined to deal with data and to create algorithms or deal with algorithms. That's changing now more and more. But I think everyone in HR, given we're in a data-driven world, in a world of increasingly of AI, that people educate themselves on data and to some extent AI as well, because it will play a larger role in our lives.
Yeah, very good point. We should all have some data literacy and algorithmic literacy to cope with the situation.
And not just literacy, I think empathy, going back to understanding the true nature of the data. And I think as analysts or consumers of data, again, you have to put yourself in a different place. And if I may, actually, it reminded me when Darren reached out to me of this poem that I had learned as a child that's perhaps apropos for this discussion. And if you don't mind, I'll just read the first stanza.
Please.
Yeah, so it's a poem by an Indian poet called Harindranath Chattopadhyay. And it's from a poem called Shaper Shaped. And so the first stanza reads as follows. In days gone by, I used to be a potter who would feel his fingers mold the yielding clay, the patterns on his wheel. But now, through wisdom lately won, that pride has gone away. I have ceased to be the potter and have learned to be the clay.
Yeah, that's a beautiful statement. I think that should be the ambition of any artificial intelligence professional, right? To become one with, if you like, your own data set. For myself, personally, I'm Buddhist, so it very much rhymes with my own way of thinking about the world. I strive for this kind of unity, so I very much like the poem you presented. So does that kind of impact the work that you do? Do you bring a personal philosophy to the game?
I guess I do, and I think the more I think about it, it's really one of empathy. And a couple of years ago, you'd be interested, I gave a talk at a conference in Amsterdam on the nirvana of people analytics. And if I recall correctly now, it's really about becoming one with the data. So that seems to make a lot of sense. I think where I've seen this more come to the surface, for me at least personally, is in my most recent work. So I began my life as an economist, a labor economist. I'm just about to complete a doctorate in organizational change and leadership. And I used a mixed methods research approach. So there was a survey or some quantitative analysis, and then some interviews and some document analysis as well. And for me, doing the interviews was actually something new. And that whole science of qualitative research and analysis was something I hadn't gravitated towards previously. I was, as an economist, strictly a quantitative researcher, an applied labor microeconometrician, to put it more accurately. And so I realized that you really get to the heart of the matter in interviews, and you get to understand people's lived experience in whatever thing it is you're studying, which you can't get to quantitatively or even in a survey, right? Now, I will say that once you've done the interview and you have the transcript, you can apply natural language processing to extract all kinds of signals from that. But just the act of listening and knowing and even putting yourself in their shoes as you think about the questions and you try and get them to speak and reveal insight and information that's going to be useful for your research. And here again, think about incentives. But anyway, the data you get from interviews just seems a lot more authentic. And so I'm a little bit of a convert now to mixed methods research and to research from interviews. And therefore I'm going to have to brush up my natural language processing skills as well. But anyway, just a thought about a certain kind of data and a certain kind of data extraction process, if you will, that requires empathy for it to deliver what you need it to.
Yeah, totally. Understanding what people have said is a complex process that needs you to put yourself into their shoes to understand why they might have said that. And so it's definitely a much more challenging way to analyze data than if you simply have a list of numbers. But it's much more insightful as well. And that exactly requires this kind of empathetic approach on part of the analyst. And so I'm really grateful that you came to the podcast and talked about your experiences with data empathy. Thank you very much, Amit, for joining us. And thank you, our audience, very much for joining the Data Empathy podcast. I'm Patrick, and was your host today. Thank you very much.
Patrick, thanks so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.